Because David Bowie is something of a shapeshifter, a man of many identities, enormous musical talents. But when he declaimed at the Brits Music Awards this week by proxy through the model Kate Moss, Scotland stay with us, will he really have any impact on the Scottish independence referendum? Or is the really important intervention that from the European Union and the British Treasury, suggesting that an independent Scotland will have to think again about its currency and EU membership? David Bowie, great musician. Are you
great
a fan?
musician. I'm a fan. I'm a fan.
You're a fan of Scotland Stay With Us as a Scotsman?
I mean, he's the master of reinvention, and he's done it again. The most unlikely thing to come back reincarnated as a defender of the Union. I think it will make a difference at the margins in that British culture, which has great heft, the nationalists had expected that young voters in particular would be very pro-independence. And actually what Bowie has done is he's reminded a portion of the Scottish electorate that, and he is although he lives in New York, he's a creature of British culture. He's reminded them what London is like and this incredible teeming cultural melting pot. And I think many young Scots don't want London after, wouldn't want independence because they don't want London to become a foreign city. They want its opportunities open to them. So it's something that the nationalists didn't see that coming. And Bowie's intervention illustrates that. Where I think the nationalists have had an incredibly difficult couple of weeks is that you have to remember that Alex Salmond's entire strategy, and he's been working on this for 25 years, was all about establishing an idea of reassurance so that you could vote in Scotland, but you would still keep the Queen as head of state. You would still use the pound sterling, and you'd have a guarantee that the morning after the referendum you'd still be in the European Union. Now, in the last couple of weeks, there's been this extraordinary assault by the UK political establishment and the Bank of England to say, no, you can't keep the pound. There isn't going to be a currency union. English voters are not going to underwrite and potentially subsidise Scottish registered banks. So that's the first big difficulty for Salmond.
And
the EU.
The EU is a huge difficulty as well.
Huge difficulty. I mean, I think Barroso may have actually slightly overplayed his hand in that I think Salmond is right that it's almost impossible longer term to imagine Scotland being entirely excluded from the EU. But Salmond's position has been that Scotland is a member of the EU, which it isn't, the UK is. And his position has been that the morning after the referendum, as I said, it is still in the EU. Now, rather than having that reassurance, the voters are told that there are going to be 2, 3, 4, 5 very difficult years involving complicated negotiations with the EU and potentially with London as well.
But also, you're a former editor of The Scotsman, so you're very much in tune with how public opinion has changed on this. The way that the euro is seen in Scotland is not the way that it was seen a few years ago before the crisis, to put it mildly. And if Scotland has to apply to get into the EU, even if it gets in, it will have to take the euro. That's the deal.
Yes. Salmond is saying that he simply won't do that. So there's an impasse there. I mean, Salmond, until very recently, until Greece and until the Eurozone implosion, Salmond's view was that Scotland needed to get away from the shackle of the sterling zone and join the euro as quickly as possible. That became electorally impossible. Very, very difficult for him. So he rapidly, on the hoof, reinvented his entire approach and said, we will keep the pound. But didn't game this properly and didn't calculate that the English, particularly the English political establishment, wouldn't just take this lying down.
Well, they may have a view on it. I mean,
they may have a view.
How do you see it? You've reported on it and so on. How do you think it's seen across the EU?
Across the EU, it's not. I mean, most people don't really understand it. That first of all, and I personally do think it's as irrational and sentimental as the Tories wanting to leave the European Union. Yet they sort of urge the Scottish people to stay within the UK. I don't think anybody really understands that in Europe, and Brussels certainly, and Barroso made that very clear, has no interest in a further splitting up of this entity.
But what's such an interesting paradox for me about this, and far be it for me as an American to say to anybody that you shouldn't break away from Britain, since of course we did this more than 200 years ago.
How did that turn out?
Fairly well.
Fairly well, that's what I thought. Yeah.
But I think what's interesting to me in some ways is that actually the EU is paying the price of its own success in some ways, because when you hear about places like Scotland, Catalonia, maybe even parts of Netherlands, or exactly, who want to break away from the nations to which they belong now, all of it's under the umbrella of the EU, because the EU has, to them, provided this safe place that they can anchor themselves to, that they imagine their independent leaders rubbing shoulders with Angela Merkel in EU meetings, and so it's in part because of the very protection that the EU provides that has encouraged this idea that they could split off and be viable nations on their own. And now Barroso is trying to go, row back all that and say, well, no, well, we can't have you breaking up, because again, in the architecture of the EU, they never really thought what would happen.
But that was you're absolutely right. That was a deliberate move made by the Brussels establishment, and that's been apparent for the last 20 years. The idea that if you encouraged a loosening of national bonds and you encourage devolution and potentially independence, you then weaken the nation state. And if you're then dealing with a nation state like the UK, which is broadly sceptical, outside the EU, problematic in all sorts of European negotiations, it looked quite tempting 10, 15 years ago to try and give money to Scotland in terms of the regional growth funds and encourage the idea that Scotland should stand on its own 2 feet. And you're absolutely right. Now it comes back to bite the EU, and it's very, very threatening.
From the outsider, it seems a little bit naive as far as Alex Salmond's politics are concerned, because I think that the fact that he didn't appreciate that the whole British establishment, Bank of England, EU, governing Conservative Party, actually all the parties in Britain will unleash all this kind of, big political blows onto him. Deal with this. How are you going to deal with this? How are you going to deal with this? It seems a little bit naive for him as a politician not to have found the answer to foresee that initially.
I mean, as you well know, he's a brilliant political tactician. He's excellent at political jiu-jitsu, and what he's done is taken all of that and said, well, this is bullying and bluster from the British establishment. And you know what? David Cameron coming to Aberdeen with his cabinet, is that going to help? This week.
Yes.
In other words, it's a very difficult thing for Cameron to do, and perhaps the best he can hope for is a revival of Labour in Scotland, paradoxically, who are the one group who can really argue effectively for the Union, with association with
the difficulty is for the Unionists is that this vote all comes down to West Central Scotland, and particularly male left-of-centre voters who 20 or 30 years ago you just weighed the vote, and it was Labour and it was Unionist, and that vote is now potentially up for grabs. So in those circumstances, Tories going to Scotland, particularly public school educated Tories like David Cameron and George Osborne, is a high-risk political strategy, because their party in Scotland has very few votes and they have very little political leverage. What Salmond now is banking on is that this British establishment intervention will produce Braveheart-style, a howl of rage and just anger, that people who might not be entirely convinced by the idea of independence just think, well, I'm not sure about it, but I certainly don't like being lectured by George Osborne and David Cameron.
This is only the start, right? So it's just the first indication of how difficult it would continue to be until the referendum vote in September.
We've got 7 months or so.
Well, exactly. So I'm thinking if 7 months before the vote, the British establishment already are using Barroso, and maybe he was right, maybe he was wrong about Scotland's future in the EU, but irrespective of that, this will continue to be. And I thought, again, from someone who is only visited Scotland on a number of occasions, and the closest link we have with Scotland is, I think, Lermontov, who is the Russian poet, and his ancestors.
I thought Russians like Robert Burns.
True,
Robbie
true.
Burns
No,
is,
absolutely. Burns nights. I took part in Burns nights. Absolutely, yeah, that's true. But again, one of those things. It's very interesting, because it would be really interesting to see what people in Catalonia think about it, what people in Corsica think about it. Moving, just sort of taking a longer view for the.
That's a threat as well. No? Spain. I mean, that Barroso made that up a bit. I mean, Spain hasn't yet said anything to that. I mean, it might rather be London, if London is still in the EU, who could vote against that.
But let's take a very black and white example. Not Catalonia because of the separatist movement there. What about just when the country wants to just disintegrate Wallonia and Flandria, for example? you know, Belgium is part of the EU. Would they really, really go against Belgian government saying, no, you know, go and negotiate with us again for the next 10 years?
Yes, or you're no longer a member if you are just
no,
Flanders or Wallonia.
and it's really hard to explain to people how on earth Scotland, being part of the EU, cannot become an independent part of the EU.
But just to touch on this, the difficult road that David Cameron's got. You know, he is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he could be the last Prime Minister of the United Kingdom if there's a yes vote. Right. But he is also, as Nicola Sturgeon, the Deputy First Minister of Scotland said, she said, quote, the living embodiment, basically, of why you should vote yes.
Right.
She is onto something there. Whatever people in the rest of the country think, that does play to exactly the kind of voters that Ian's talking about.
And I think you're right that they're going to have to rely on non-Tory, non-public school educated, although plenty of Labour politicians are public school educated politicians, to try to make the case. But I think we already saw a taste of what they feel they need to do in terms of good cop, bad cop. I mean, you had David Cameron love bombing, as they said, Scotland just a week before. Then George Osborne took the gloves off and said, "Now I'm going to play a little bit of hardball." And I think probably they're not necessarily off the mark in that there needs to be the hard sell and the soft sell. I mean, for those who might be wavering, the soft sell might appeal to their sentimental side. For some of those who might be wavering, they need to know just the the hard facts.
You might have a point about the cultural leaders, to go back to David Bowie again. I mean, just to say, you know, it's not a rational argument. It's just Scotland stay with us has got a certain degree of power. You might think, oh, entertainers forget what they say, but it does have a kind of sense of affection.
It did, yeah. I think it was worth, as someone who doesn't want the United Kingdom to break up, I think it was worth 1,000 interventions by politicians. I think it was a very interesting, very important moment. And Salmond, in comparison, now risk looking rather kind of mean-minded and ridiculous, really. I mean, his response the other morning when he gave a speech was to say, you say we can't use the pound? Yes, we can, trying to invoke Barack Obama. Unfortunately, he was doing this in a hotel function suite in Aberdeen in front of 200 people, rather than 150,000 people in a stadium in the US. So the effect was slightly ruined. But I mean,
and also there are those who would say, "Yes, we can" was a great slogan. It's not quite worked out so well for Barack Obama either.
But also, what the UK political establishment is saying politely on behalf of English and Welsh and Northern Ireland voters, and the polls show that they're backed in this. They say, well, yes, you can, but you should be aware before you do this that there are very serious consequences.
But, Gavin, and you make an interesting point, though, about non-political public figures and how, at least from my viewing, they've been relatively absent so far in this campaign. And I would have thought that by now, for example, the yes side would have said, yeah, that's true. Let's get Andy Murray out there talking about the importance of Scottish independence, and perhaps on the no side, get J.K. Rowling to write Harry Potter and the importance of the United Kingdom, you know, and get these figures to exert their influence. And yet that hasn't happened, which I find very curious.
But it's not because any of these figures aren't interested or don't care. It's because many of them, I've talked to a few people who don't want to step into it just yet, but we'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thanks very much. Thank you. That's it for